My name is Christopher Michael Yap, and I am a PhD candidate in the Nara Institute of Science and Technology in Japan, and I'm from the Internet Engineering Laboratory. I study narrative and video games, and today I'm going to be presenting my paper entitled Conceptualizing Player-side Emergence in Interactive Games between Hardcoded Software and the Human Mind in Papers, Please, and Gone Home. This was the paper that I presented at the International Academic Conference on Meaningful Play 2014 on August 17th, 2014 at Michigan State University at East Lansing. So before I actually get into the presentation proper, I do have to make some acknowledgments. This research trip to present at the Meaningful Play Conference of 2014 this time has been funded using crowdfunding on Indiegogo, and that campaign was called Video Game Studies. It ran from the beginning of August to about the middle of September for 5 weeks with the modest goal of about $2,000 US. We were able to successfully exceed that by $581, and you can check out the details of the campaign at the following link. One of the perks for this Indiegogo campaign was that you could basically become a shadow member of the secret society, which is basically major contributors to video game studies. But if you want to go full Metal Gear, we'll just call them the Patriots. So here they are. And if anyone out there is interested in using crowdfunding for their research purposes, feel free to contact me at any time. I'll go ahead and put my contact information at the end of this presentation. So let's get right into it. Today's outline is, firstly, I want to talk about what is emergence, how has it existed in other fields, and understanding this, we can kind of get a general sense of how emergence might occur in games. In particular, today this paper is really about presenting an idea that I had. It's still very much in its early embryonic form. I want to develop it further for my PhD research. I started to play the games Papers, Please, and Gone Home, and I began to notice, I started to observe a phenomenon that I wasn't exactly sure how to conceptualize. So I'm proposing an idea in this presentation and in this paper about how to sort of think of the game design in terms of emergence with these two games as case studies. We're going to head into a discussion after that, which is basically about how designers can try to use this to their advantage. And then the conclusion, which basically is composed of the future work, what really remains to be done, what are the next steps for this research. So let's get right into it. What is emergence? Basically, emergence is the idea that a surprising and novel thing can emerge from a complex system. So the basic example that's used a lot of the times is the snowflake. These are all start from the same constituent parts, materials. So a mote of dust and some water and ice, and basically same conditions, same state space. So you're talking about temperature and humidity and pressure. But basically the resultant crystalline forms are each kind of unique, and the thing to remember with emergence is that results often do not exhibit the characteristics of the constituent parts it came from. In fact, as a result, results are difficult or if not impossible to predict. This is a very important thing for emergence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, emergence is used in other scientific fields such as computer science. We kind of know the idea of emergent AI or Skynet and Terminator. We also know that this idea is referenced in biology and philosophy. So I wanted to kind of bring up a biological example because it's a little bit happier. So the biological example of emergence is the concept of abiogenesis, or the way that life began on the planet Earth. We have a primordial ooze, which is our state space. We have our constituent parts, so basically represented by a large number of amino acids floating in and around each other. Now, after a certain amount of time and probability, these amino acids then begin to emerge and snowflake into proteins, which then also converge and snowflake and emerge into the first DNA. So, you know, after that we have life on Earth, or so says the theory. This is a biological example of emergence. Now, in particular, key factors for emergence, there are two, and I'm kind of simplifying, but this is so that I can sort of get this concept out there. Complexity, and with games, ambiguous design. When we talk about complexity, we're talking about having sufficiently intricate moving parts, and many of them. And with ambiguous design, we're simply talking about a wide enough state space. We contend that if you have these two factors, emergence is encouraged. Not guaranteed, but encouraged. So how might emergence occur in games? The current industry with games and many examples in both AAA and indie exhibit various degrees of emergence, and through design, by looking at the design of the games and the goals, we can actually see that some there are some ways to head towards emergence. There are two non-mutually exclusive approaches. So with any game in any aspect, we can do the tech approach or the design approach. So with the technological approach, we're thinking about things in terms of emergence like artificial intelligence or procedural generation. With the design end, we're talking about more sort of aesthetics, ambiguity of design, good direction choices, non-interference, immersion, sort of more ethereal concerns, but overall have a very subjective output. So with the tech approach, we're also thinking of things like graphical photorealism, high visual fidelity, or maybe even with the AI thing, are we actually going to construct a game that is a computer dungeon master, that can pass the Turing test? Another thing is, like, for example, we have Minecraft. This is a sort of interesting technological example with randomly generated games and procedurally generated content. So although the AAA industry, or well, the industry at large, has come pretty close to doing some impressive things with technology and graphics, we're not quite there yet. We've come pretty close, but arguably game innovation stagnates. And one of the people who really sort of has seen this was Warren Spector. He gave a talk at GDC 2013 where he basically said, you know, our graphics are really good, our photorealism is not at issue here. What concerns him is that they're still trying to innovate by having black box hidden dice rolls and having that sort of come out as the innovation or the surprise. And he basically dared everyone in the audience. He says, we can do better than that. And I believe so too. So if we can't quite improve on the tech approach right now, where else can we expand? This is where we're talking about sort of the design end of things, where we indicate or guide the player indirectly, or what's called a directorial sleight of hand. And this is what I recognize was occurring in the games Papers, Please, and Gone Home, which are interestingly indie games as well. And basically what I'm saying is that the current examples indicate that a kind of emergent experience can still be rendered. It's not true emergence in the sense of, for example, the snowflake or the biological emergence, but it's an emergence nonetheless that occurs sort of on the player side of things, that it's experiential. So let's go back to this model here, key factors for emergence in games. We said that we need complexity and ambiguous design. Now with complexity in games, we're talking about fixed elements from the game software, characters, events, audio-visual aspects, all of those sort of Lego bits. And with ambiguous design, sufficiently wide state space means the arrangement of elements to indicate or suggest an experience or interpretation. This is the important part right here. We're trying to arrange the elements in order to indicate or suggest, not to directly put the path linear or to just lock them down to experience, because locking down an experience would be the opposite of emergence. We want to give it a push in a particular direction, and then we want to see what we can do, or what can happen rather. So basically, emergent systems are encouraged if there is complexity. Now, game software and game consoles, we can only get so technologically complex with that. The current industry tech cannot render emergence in the essential sense. So, what I contend I was seeing in Papers, Please, and Gone Home is that through careful balance of tech and design, we can invoke another system extraneous to the game software. Now, that's kind of tricky. How are we going to ensure that we can get a complex system if we didn't put it in there to begin with? What can do that? It turns out the human brain is a fairly complex system, and it can probably do that. In fact, it does this a lot. Creates imaginary scenarios, gets mad. But in terms of games, I think this is a little bit more apropos. Knows literally everything about me, but uses this information to give me perfectly crafted nightmares. And this kind of goes along with this in and of itself is sort of hinting at the conceptualized player-side emergence. I had actually spoken with Joshua Farkas from Cubicle Ninjas, and he had basically just played PT, the horror game from Kojima. And what it was is, we discussed that the scariest thing about this game was not that it actually showed you what was happening. It showed you everything up to the horror, and then it let you sort of nudged you in the direction of the horror, and then your brain took over from there and made it the most scariest experience it could possibly be for you, because now your imagination's kind of invoked. So the thing to know about the brain is that it's always sort of looking for patterns. In particular, though, what really helps out with this player-side emergence is that sometimes the brain contextualizes things for you. Some of you might have seen this photo before. This is literally a poorly erected coat hanger. But when the brain looks at it, perhaps it is drunk octopus who wants to fight. This is the brain sort of conceptualizing something. in a way that makes sense to it. So we're going to go back to this pretty model. Again, complexity, fixed elements from game software, those things that the developer and the designer can put into the game before shipping that they really can't change afterwards unless it's a DLC. And then ambiguous design, the state space, the arrangement of elements to indicate or suggest an experience or interpretation. Most game developers will look at this and say, this is way too pretty. This model here is far too pretty. It's not pretty like this in real life when we try to design a game, and that's true. So to reflect more of the sort of chaotic state of game design, we know that ambiguous game elements, or ambiguous design and game elements sort of weigh differently depending on the game project, and these are all software side concerns. How do we get emergence on player side? Well, if we can render the game elements and the ambiguous design through the human brain, and if we can just suggest to the human brain a range of possible constructions, the brain's imagination, if sufficiently triggered, can actually lead to the next part of that, which is the player-side emergence. So this slide here, slide 16, this is sort of my concept of player-side emergence in a nutshell. So now let's talk about the games that I was observing this in. Papers, Please. This is the first game. Again, Lucas Pope from 2013. It's essentially a paperwork simulator. The interactions are morally implicit, and effects and outcomes are stated as simple facts with little to no emotion indication. So let's look at the typical game screen here. This is your typical Papers, Please game screen, and that's a lot of information. You already have a lot of game bits to work with, so the complexity is sort of visually there and functionally there. In the top left corner, we have an unceasing line of ambiguous, faceless humanity, and they only gain a facial identity once they get into your booth. And so at that point, they give you the paperwork you need to make your decision, and at this point, you just have to decide yes or no. There's already sort of a story coming together. If the player's brain is given all this information, of course the player has the choice to sort of try to interpret all of this in a non-narrative information processing fashion, but the processing is occurring, and a lot of people try to narrativize naturally, narrativize and sort of contextualize their experience. In particular, I do want to bring up this screen where essentially this is at the end of each day. You get a monetary breakdown of how well or not well you did at the end of the day. And what I want to bring your attention to is this information here. And essentially this is the only bit of information that you get in the game about your fictional family. They don't get a face, not like the people coming through your booth. They just get status conditions. Now what this does is it triggers the mind. It invokes certain definitions. If I don't have a picture of my fictional mother-in-law or uncle or wife or son, by invoking the name by just textual information only and giving a state, the only other association we can make is by putting our own personal mother-in-law, uncle, wife, son into this position. So all of this sort of, whatever emotions or particular ways you feel about this, which will influence the way you play this game, come from the player side of things. So this game is giving you lots of pieces and suggesting a construction, and the construction takes place, and the burden of that takes place on the player themselves. Now, in terms of Gone Home, this is an interesting game that is sort of touted as a story exploration game. You explore an empty house to find out where your sister went. The story construction is freeform, but the end is unified. I like to think of this as akin to a jigsaw puzzle. Essentially, a jigsaw puzzle, with the jigsaw puzzle, it's not so important the order you construct it as much as understanding how each piece fits in relation to the other in order to form the whole story. So because this is freeform exploration, you're basically getting a lot of different jigsaw pieces at a random order, the order you decide to wander through the game in. So let's look at some of those jigsaw pieces now. So here is the empty room in a house with the lights on and no one's home. Here's a note to you, the player character, that says all the wrong things to someone who is curious. It says, "Katie, I'm not here. Please do not look around for me. I love you. Bye." We then search the house because we're curious, and we find lots of evidence of a ghost hunt, ghost sightings, ghostly sort of, how do you say, items and other things like that, and symbols. And then at some point you may wander up into the bathroom and find the blood stain. Now all of this sort of comes together in your mind without direct direction. I know it's a bit recursive. But what ends up happening here is a player-side reconstruction of events that contextually makes sense to you, the player. So basically, what the game Gone Home is giving you without total direction is an empty house, a ghost story, a bloody bathtub, and so all of these things sort of contribute to invoking certain tropes of horror story. But for those of you who have played the game, know that this is actually not a horror game. It's not a horror story. I don't want to spoil the end for you guys if you haven't played the game. So I'm just going to basically, my point here is that it's not so much about the horror story, which it's not. Rather, this is how the game encourages or suggests the construction or interpretation of its narrative. So Gone Home sort of plays with certain ideas of fruitful ambiguity and smart design choices in allowing the player to sort of explore the house at their leisure and construct a tale almost subconsciously, which kind of leads us to what we can use what we can use the concept of player-side emergence for. So as a design consideration or a design principle, you can potentially use this idea when designing a game. It's helpful in addressing something we call ludonarrative dissonance, or rather when the game mechanics come into contention with the game narrative or vice versa. A classic example of this would be Final Fantasy VII when Aerith died. The game mechanics say that you can resurrect her with a phoenix down. However, in order for the story to have the impact that it needed to have and for it to go in the direction the directors wanted it to have, she just simply had to stay dead. So with addressing ludonarrative dissonance using player-side emergence as a concept or design principle, we can basically allow the player's own mind to account for discrepancies between mechanics and narrative. Wherever there's a logical discrepancy between those two, because a lot of times it's very unavoidable, but if we can minimize those discrepancies and have the mind sort of rationalize their way around it, that might actually be more helpful. In fact, a lot of examples that we could cite essentially say that, show that the more specifically we lock down game mechanics and lock down narrative, the harder they can come into contention with each other. So we're looking for, again, a fruitful level of ambiguity. Also, designing towards player-side emergence also allows the players to sort of interpret centralized or directed or embedded game narratives with their own subjective overtones and inflections. So this is sort of what was happening with Papers, Please, where we're not exactly telling you how to feel about your family, but if you feel a certain way about your family and we sort of invoke those definitions, you may also be drawing in those feelings of your own subjectivity into it as well. So we can have the game the game narrative and experience be emergently colored by whatever the player's sort of own experience is. Now, here's the flip side. The balance between reliance on tech versus reliance on design, as well as the degree to which designers can be ambiguous with their designs while retaining the integrity of the overall gaming experience, is still being investigated in terms of player-side emergence. Again, as I mentioned, this idea of player-side emergence, this concept, is still very much in its early phases, and I would very much like to develop it further into, right now it's just a concept, but I want to develop it further into something we can maybe use more consistently towards game design and towards also game interpretation and criticism. As games become increasingly more sophisticated, immersive, and interactive, considerations for player-side emergence will also change significantly. And it's not written here, but this is also changes due to the advance of technology. Technology is basically going to reshape and influence the ways in which games are going to be made, whatever the era, as we've seen. So this too will also sort of play into the amorphous, or rather not amorphous, but the sort of ever-changing definition or parameters of player-side emergence. So in conclusion, the examples of Gone Home and Papers, Please show that a kind of player-side emergence which invokes the complex system of the player mind to render the emergence can be crafted utilizing current technology if the design space is sufficiently ambiguous and the contextual direction is effective. I know that those are very lofty and amorphous goals, but generally speaking, we can sort of work in our research to define those goals down to a point. I don't believe they're going to become super defined, because if they do, it's sort of, in my opinion, in my educated opinion, sort of then becomes a pursuit that is not entirely aesthetic. But anyway, we'll see. I'll keep you guys posted. For the future work, there's quite a lot to do with this concept. Firstly, test and select an appropriate theoretical framework for this concept. We're looking at a bunch of different things. Actually, at the Meaningful Play conference, we were very lucky to have seen several talks about systems, thinking in terms of systems for a bunch of different things related to games. And I think that this is also going to be playing a key role in the development of player-side emergence as a concept. So, in other words, if you're looking at something in terms of a system, if you can't just pick up one part to look at without yanking on other parts that it's connected to. So, Professor Casey O'Donnell of Michigan State University was talking about systems in terms of looking at things holistically. Our keynote speaker, Aaron Hoffman from Glass Lab, also sort of touched upon this idea of thinking about things in terms of systems, which would help us to produce better balanced games, which is great because if you really think about games, they are a system. You're basically putting player inputs into a system that's both sort of like a hybrid mash of a bunch of different mediums and technologies. So I think this is a fruitful way to go. Oh, we're also looking at Ian Bogost's unit operations as a way to sort of maybe reconcile some of these mysteries that we're working with. We also need to analyze other games to see how this concept applies or doesn't apply. In particular, we're thinking of pervasive games and ARGs. And lastly, we need to devise and experiment with ways to both observe and show player-side emergence in action. I want to refrain from using the word measure because I don't think we're there yet, and I'm not exactly sure if this is something that we can do, but maybe this is just semantics. I'm not too sure. But anyway, that's my paper on conceptualizing player-side emergence and Gone Home and Papers, Please. If you need to get in contact with me, you can reach me at the following links. Probably the best place to go is my research blog and Medias Resolution, which is at www.chrisyap.com, or you can just email me straight up at smartbad.gmail. Find me on Facebook or go ahead and give me a tweet. Thanks for listening.